Welcome to the Simply Financial podcast. I'm your host, Christopher Calandra. So I have a great episode for you today. As you know, if you're a regular listener, I am doing a series in conjunction with Nationwide Retirement Institute. And so this is the second in a three-part series. The first episode was on Social Security. If you haven't listened to that yet, I strongly suggest you go back and listen to that. That conversation was with my brother, who works for Nationwide and is part of the Retirement Institute. This episode today is focused on women and retirement. I have with me Roberta Eckert of the Institute. And just so you know, the third in the series, which will be published very soon, is going to be on healthcare costs in retirement. So with all of that said, Roberta, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks so much. We appreciate the opportunity to be on your call.
So isn't this great that we're going to do a podcast episode on women in retirement? Because I don't know if you noticed, but I am not a woman.
I did notice that.
But in my practice here at Elliott Wealth Management Services, we deal with either single women, could be divorced, could be widows, or even if they're in a marriage or some type of family partnership, they take the lead or are very involved in financial planning and investment related matters. So I have a high level of expertise and experience and a desire to interact with my female clients in a very good way. And I'll also say from a personal standpoint, Roberta, even though I'm not a woman, I am married. In fact, we just celebrated 25 years of marriage. And as I look towards the future, being 50 years old, and we plan for our retirement and for the next phases in our life, I always want to make sure that our planning will take care of my wife, Joelle, regardless of what happens. If I were to pass away earlier than her, I would want to make sure that we have a plan that takes care of her needs and she's taken care of. So even though I'm not a woman, I do have a vested interest in this topic.
Good. Well, glad to hear you say all of that. And congratulations on 25 years of marriage. That's awesome.
Thank you so much. So maybe you could start and just from a high level, kind of talk a little bit about some of the special considerations that a woman has as it relates to retirement income planning. Can you open up the discussion talking a little bit about that?
Yeah, of course. And I think when you look at women's journey to retirement, it's different than men's for a few reasons. We all end up in the same place, but the journey's different. I like to think of it as more circuitous as opposed to linear. And I'll give you an example of that. Let's say that you and I are exactly the same age. We went to the same school. We got the exact same grades. We got the exact same job, invested the exact same way. Everything is exactly the same, except for when we retire. And one of the things that's going to happen, very likely, is that I may have a retirement savings gap, while you may not. Why is that? Because of one of the challenges, and that is life expectancy. We females, statistically speaking, are going to outlive you guys. We've got a longer retirement to plan for. So that's really number one. Number two is something called the earnings wage gap. Sometimes people call it the gender wage gap. A lot of that points to the role of the caregiver, which is point number three. So when we think about role of the caregiver, sociologically, we've kind of been the one that's raised our hands and said, we'll be the caregivers. Many women have told us that that is a honor as opposed to a burden, but we want to be thinking about the role of the caregiver also as being expanded, not just beyond what you traditionally think of, which is maybe caring for aging parents or an aging spouse, but the other generation as well, stepping out of the workforce, maybe to raise a young family. Maybe then the kids are going back into school. Then you might take a part-time job. And that's what I mean by the retirement journey being a little more circuitous as opposed to linear. So the three challenges really boil down to life expectancy, gender wage gap, and then role of the caregiver.
Excellent. That was a great illustration, and it does make sense. I mentioned, my wife and I, she has been mostly out of the workforce while our kids were growing up, and that was a decision that worked for us. It's not for everyone, but that would be, in my personal circumstance, an important consideration, because her earnings by choice during her normal working years were severely handicapped because of our lifestyle choice. And that's a consideration as we plan for retirement. So I get what you're saying. In reviewing the Retirement Institute's information on this subject, which is great, by the way, great information. You talk about two models of women out there today. Can you touch on that for me, please?
Yeah, and I think probably the model that we look at more, maybe more importantly, are the women that are really getting closer to retirement right now. So these might be women in their 60s, maybe even a little older, maybe a little younger. But if you think about it, what we looked at was a lot of strides that women have made, profound impact in things like politics, business, education, pop culture, fashion. So we've made tremendous strides in all of those areas, but maybe at different levels. At the same time, one thing that bubbled up when we were doing some research was that one thing standing in the way of women's successful retirement is uncertainty. And I thought, how could this possibly be? We are not a group of hand-wringing ninnies. So why the sudden uncertainty? And it came upon me one day. In fact, in the presentation that I delivered, I've got a picture of my mom and my dad. It was taken in 1943. In Fort Knox, Kentucky. My father was a captain in the United States Army. Mom is all of 24 years old, rocking a fur coat. It's really, I think, a great picture. But really, the one model there is the model of that type of individual and what the role or what the impact was on their children. So what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that if I went to my mother and I said, tell me what your retirement looks like. How do you envision your retirement? She'd look at me like I just grew a second head. And she'd say, what are you talking about? Retirement is your father's area. He's doing the investing, you know, it's his job. He knows about his pension, et cetera, et cetera. She said, if you really push me, I would say my primary objective is to play with the grandchildren, visit with them, keep your father out from underfoot, maybe do a little traveling. But for any more details, go talk to him. So this is what we have learned, or what women in their 60s have learned retirement looks like. Or put another way, they haven't had a clear-cut path or a role model that set out retirement on their own terms. Now, the second model is maybe that group of individuals' own children. So let's say a 60-year-old woman has a 30-year-old daughter. Now that 30-year-old daughter has a different role model or a different path that she could emulate. So now those maybe 50 and 60-year-old women are saying, well, I've had my own career. I have my own retirement desires. I either want to start a new business, maybe I want to do charitable work, maybe I want to go back and work in a job that's always been my passion, but never really paid the bills. So women of a certain age group are defining retirement on their own terms. And those same women might not have had, again, a role model that was clearly laid out for themselves. So those are the two roles, I suppose, or models that we see. And it's been really interesting to see how that all plays out in actuality and retirement income planning.
That makes sense. And I see that, having worked with women throughout my career, especially over this last stretch of time, they do often have a greater vision of their retirement than what you described with your mom. And I think subsequent generations, that will be even more true. And that's what I hope, say, for my daughter, who's only 21 years old, so clearly has a long way to go. But as a father, you know, that's what I would hope for my daughter, to be empowered on such an important topic. Let's double back a bit, Roberta, because we talked about caretaker. And in terms of retirement planning, I think that at first glance, it seems not only that it's a special consideration, but it is somewhat negative, right? If you have a caretaker and that caretaker is a woman, which is what you find most often in the marketplace. There are exceptions. Is it all negative in terms of planning for retirement? If somebody is out there listening and they are a caretaker, either a stay-at-home mom like my wife is, or somebody that leaves or works less to take care of parents or even a spouse, is it all bad news for them on the financial front in terms of planning for retirement? Can you talk a little bit of how caretakers should look at their retirement planning?
Sure. In fact, one interesting statistic is that 75% of caretakers have what I think of as two jobs. One job is that traditional paid job. So they're working, outside of the house for money. And the other job is that informal unpaid role as a caregiver. So those are kind of some things to consider. About 60% of caregivers are women. That number on the surface has come down. That percentage of caregivers that are women used to be much higher. But when you distill that through a little bit more, what you'll find is that women caregivers are also doing a little bit more of the heavy lifting. In other words, they are doing the helping mom bathe, helping mom eat, doing all of those hands-on things. And men were self-identifying as caregivers when they were doing things like driving mom to the doctor, picking up medicine, things of that nature. So the numbers might be a little skewed there. But to your question, no, it's certainly not all negative. In fact, I mentioned earlier that many, many people have said to us, women, that caregiving is an honor. So, it's not all about the money, but you have to consider the financial ramifications, right? So I think, it's all about planning, right? So if you anticipate that that's going to be a situation in your household, and I'll use that role of caregiver for an aging spouse, for example, then if that's something that might be an issue, then you want to make plans. So one of the biggest events in your life is going to be retirement. So Chris, you mentioned you have a 21-year-old daughter. It would not shock me at all to think that one of the events that you and your wife are planning for some date down the road is a wedding, right? That's an event you plan for. Retirement's probably one of the biggest events you plan for. And as a result of that, planning or factoring in long-term care policy or insurance or what have you might not be a bad direction to go, or at least something to investigate. So no, the financial impacts of all that certainly don't have to be bad, provided that you've put some plans in place to account for those different areas.
No, that's great. And, one of the observations that I have, having met with, a very large number of people, over the years, given my craft, is that it seems to me that a particularly vulnerable, I want to make sure I articulate this the right way. I think a vulnerable part of women are women that are married and have been married for probably a while. And as we talked about, the male tends to get sick and pass away earlier. And then, so you often have what plays out is the following. Husband and wife enter into, let's say, retirement. Husband falls ill. Whatever is needed money-wise is used for his care. Plus his spouse, his partner, will be there side by side and help take care of him. Then he passes away. Now the surviving spouse, the widow in this instance, is more vulnerable because a lot of treasure was expended for the care of the first spouse who was sick. And now that woman also doesn't have her life partner to do the same thing for her that she did for her husband. And that seems to be something that needs to be addressed in planning, because that's often how it plays out. So that's my bias, what I've seen and what I talk to my clients about. What do you think about that perspective? What's your thought?
I think it is a great perspective because so much of that is true. And we, in fact, call that the double-edged sword. And women tend to fall on that double-edged sword.
Yes, they do.
So to kind of reiterate what you were saying, your spouse becomes ill, you're providing the unpaid level of care, at least in the initial stages before things might need to be a little more formalized and they might go into an assisted living facility or even a nursing home. But in the early years, you might be providing that unpaid level of care. Fast forward, the spouse passes away, and now as a surviving female spouse, your own informal level of care, safety net, if you will, that's provided by a spouse has now been removed.
Yes.
And when we did some of our research, women told us they are very, very reluctant to have to rely on their children to provide that care. They don't want to disrupt their life. They don't want to have the children move, for example, to come and care for them. All of those issues, right, that can revolve around that. So in my opinion, that's why I think it's especially important to investigate what you could be doing in order to protect the surviving spouse, generally female, but to protect the surviving spouse, not only to preserve her choices about where she can receive care, but also how she is going to pay for it. And especially within the context of what you said, I love the word treasure, when a lot of the treasure has possibly been expended on caring for the male spouse.
Right.
So yeah, I think in terms of double-edged sword, and it's particularly impactful on women.
Yeah, well said, well said. The thing we talked about earlier is that women have a longer life expectancy. So for planning for retirement, we have a longer time horizon statistically. And so there's some considerations there. I know the Institute, and I've covered this on some of the other episodes I've done with some of your coworkers, including my brother, is the importance of asset location, the buckets of money. So can you talk a little bit about that, especially as it relates to the challenges women confront in retirement as part of their longer life expectancy?
Yeah, sure. I think it stands to reason that if you have to take money out of your retirement savings, regardless of where they're located, if you don't have to pay taxes on some of that money, then you don't have to take as much out of the plan, and consequently, it can stay there and potentially grow and compound, et cetera. So that's the basic premise. So if you can engineer your retirement savings so that earlier you have set up 3 buckets of money, a taxable, a tax deferred, and a tax-free bucket. So taxable, tax deferred, and tax-free, then you can engineer how that income is going to come out in retirement so that you can keep yourself potentially in a lower tax bracket and not bump up against larger tax brackets. And so a lot of times people say, well, like, why is that relevant to women? Well, because if you can engineer your drawdown off of your retirement savings so that it is as tax efficient as possible, meaning you're paying less in taxes or only as little as you could possibly pay, then the money that you are not taking out of your portfolio stays in the portfolio with the potential to grow and compound. And if you're living a longer life, then you want your portfolio to last as long as it possibly can too. And that's why I think tax efficiency is really important for women because of that life expectancy. You want that portfolio to last, and one way to do that is through tax efficiency.
Yeah, that's very true. It seems to me, especially with all the planning tools, the different levers that can be pulled, and individuals could do this on their own, but I'm a big believer in helping, getting help using professionals. Like, I'm a certified financial planner. I'm a subject matter expert that I want to be able to help people so they can make informed decisions. So if you could plan properly, any way you could mitigate taxes means that you are extending the life of your nest egg. And for everyone, that's a desirable goal. It's even more important for women, as we just spoke about. And the idea with the 3 different buckets of money is that in different years, there might be opportunities planning wise to take the income, to take withdrawals that the client needs so that they could live a fulfilling retirement. But by pulling different levers, deciding maybe take a little more from here, a little less from here, depending on the circumstances in a given year, you could mitigate taxes. And again, that extends the life of the nest egg, which is incredibly important. And it's what everybody desires anyway. It's common sense. So the three buckets are very, very important. And in some of listeners, some of the other episodes I've done with the Institute, we've covered Roth IRAs, we've covered HSAs, we've covered Social Security, which I have a question for you about in a moment, Roberta. So listen to some of these other episodes we've done. You could find them, listeners, at my website, elliottwealth.com. The entire series I've done with Nationwide and the Retirement Institute is there. One thought that I had, Roberta, is that Roth accounts, IRAs, as well as Roths within a 401k are becoming more and more popular. There's more and more money being accumulated in those vehicles. And it's the same thing with HSAs also. I think you would agree that moving forward, the planning possibilities for retirees, including women, are going to be even greater than they are today as we have more and more of these other buckets filled up with money. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's very true. And, when you think about the way that the tax code and the tax laws are structured today, there is, certainly this is not intended to be a political statement at all, but there is some school of thought that thinks that tax brackets are going to be higher in the future.
Yes.
So whether they are or not, still good, I think, to plan for any eventuality. And having money that you can draw out tax-free, I think is super important, because let's say that you are now in the marginal tax bracket at 12%, and you don't want to go into that next tax bracket, that next level, but you still need some more money to pay for your various expenses in retirement. So once you've bumped up at the top of that 12% tax bracket, then you can turn to your tax-free bucket of money and start drawing down on that in order to meet those needs too. And I think, a lot of people don't always realize that. And really, Chris, what we're talking about is federal taxes. I know you're in Connecticut. That's a pretty high tax state, right? Yeah. My sister lives in New Jersey. And she says, I'm getting slammed with personal property taxes. And then when I go to the grocery store, I go fill up my car with gas. All of those things are other ancillary taxes that pile on. And so that, I think, doesn't necessarily speak to drawing money out of your retirement plans effectively from a tax perspective, but, taxes obviously impact us much more than on the federal and state level.
In the previous episode in the series, my brother and I covered Social Security. And given the longevity and some of the challenges related to women, it seems like the Social Security decision or topic, let me say, the Social Security topic is very important. And so maybe you touch a little bit on some considerations for women in thinking about Social Security?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, Social Security, as you know, really has a lot of moving parts. There are over 2,700 different filing rules. And the ones that I talk about very frequently in my Women in Retirement presentation, I think one of the biggest ones have to do with survivorship. So women, statistically speaking, will outlive men. And when you think about a survivor benefit, in fact, more than 95% of that benefit is paid to women, because statistically speaking, we're the survivors. And so much so, in fact, that it's called the widow benefit. But don't take them literally, because in fact, it could be paid to widows or to widowers. So in a conventional scenario, in a very stereotypical scenario, what often happens is that a husband will look at the Social Security, maybe a calculator, maybe they're talking to their financial advisor, and the advisor says, or the calculator online says, okay, well, based on your life expectancy and based on your earnings and this, that, and the other thing, you should claim at X age. And what they so often fail to overlook is that number one, if the husband is anticipated to predecease the wife, meaning she's the surviving spouse, and if he is the primary breadwinner, meaning his Social Security check is the larger of the two, the one that she would get and then the one that he would get, that upon his passing, she will step into his check, take it over for the rest of her life. So put another way, the biggest check is going to last until the second death. So when people are doing planning, they need to think beyond the male's life expectancy and instead plug in the female's life expectancy, because she is the one that's going to inherit that larger check until the time that she passes away. So that's something that I think when it comes to planning is really, really important for people to understand, even to the point where sometimes we've seen people who have said, this is terrible news. Harvey has had a terrible illness. He is not expected to live more than a year or two. We're going to go ahead and take Social Security now to get some income coming in, where in reality, it seems a little counterintuitive. They probably ought to wait for Harvey to claim, even up to the point at which he passes away or later, because by delaying, as I know you know, Chris, for every year that you delay past your full retirement age, there is an 8% annual credit that's accrued on top of the benefit. So the longer the spouse waits to claim, the larger the check they will leave to their surviving spouse. And that's something, again, a lot of people really don't think in those terms.
Yes.
And one other quick Social Security comment, if I may, but I saw you about to ask me something else. So go ahead.
No, go ahead. You're on a roll. Go ahead.
I'm on a roll, right? I know. The other thing, it has to do with divorced spouses. And this is something really a lot of people don't know. Let's imagine, and it's not hard to imagine because it's fact, my husband and I are married to each other. And let's imagine that we can claim a spousal benefit. According to the eligibility rules, which, you know, unless you need me to, won't go into right now. Either he could claim a spousal benefit on me, or I could claim a spousal benefit on him, but we can't do cross-claim a spousal benefit at the same time. It's one or the other. It goes one way or the other. But if we were to divorce, we actually could do that. I could claim an ex-spousal benefit on him, and he could claim an ex-spousal benefit on me. So we could cross-claim. And that is something, again, that a lot of folks overlook. Why is that important? Because females' economic situation generally deteriorates in the case of a divorce. And yet, at the same time, there is a thing called gray divorce. And what that means is that in the cohort group of the age 50 years old or older, the divorce rate's more than doubled since the 90s. So, you know, it's definitely a thing, and particularly impactful to women whose, as I said, economic situation deteriorates in a divorce. Again, statistically speaking, not all.
No, I understand. And it brings up a good point, because if you're listening, the idea is when you're confronted with these decisions, sometimes the common sense answer, like deferring, is not necessarily the optimal decision. And that's why you ought to, so that you can make the best decision possible, either research it yourself or get some help. Attorneys, accountants, CPAs, financial planners, so that you can make the best decision for your individual situation. Because if there's 10 people that are in, let's say, a divorce situation, depending on age, income, wage gap differential, any number of factors, you could have lots of different optimal choices amongst the 10. Is that right, Roberta?
Yes, that's very, very true. And I would say, for the love of God, don't listen to your neighbor, because they don't always have all the facts either. So yes, go to a financial professional, but I would say even extend that to a CPA like you are, Chris, a financial advisor that has some expertise in Social Security. No doubt about it.
That's great. Well, Roberta, this was as good a discussion as I had hoped for. Again,
Excellent.
I appreciate your time. I appreciate the support of Nationwide, and in particular, the Retirement Institute. So as I said, listeners, at the beginning, this is the second part of the 3-part series. So if you liked this content, and I hope you did, check back and listen to the previous one on Social Security, and keep an eye out for the upcoming episode that'll be healthcare costs and retirement. Again, Roberta, thanks so much, and I'll talk to you soon.
Yeah, Chris, I enjoyed it. Thanks again.
The views expressed are not necessarily the opinion of SagePoint Financial Incorporated and should not be construed directly or indirectly as an offer to buy or sell any securities mentioned herein. Investing is subject to risks, including loss of principal invested. Past performance is not a guarantee of future results. No strategy can assure a profit nor protect against loss. Please note that individual situations can vary. Therefore, the information should be relied upon when coordinated with individual professional advice. Please note, the information being provided is strictly as a courtesy. When you link to any of the websites provided here, you are leaving this website. We make no representation as to the completeness or accuracy of the information provided at these websites, nor is the company liable for any direct or indirect technical or system issues or any consequences arising out of your access to your use of third-party technologies, websites, information, and programs made available through this website. When you access one of these websites, you are leaving our website and assume total responsibility and risk for your use of the websites you are linking to. Securities and advisory services are offered through SagePoint Financial Incorporated, member FINRA SIPC. Insurance services offered through Elliott Wealth Management, LLC, not affiliated with SagePoint Financial.